The scent of premium scotch and unfiltered ambition always arrived 10 paces before Cho Yang-eun did. Outside, the city was a sprawling, indifferent beast, its streets slick with a cold rain that tasted of industrial grit and forgotten souls. But inside the Golden Crane, the world was refined, gold-leafed, and deadly silent. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen tears above floors polished to a mirror sheen, reflecting the faces of men who bought and sold lives between courses. The air was thick with the low, voracious hum of power brokers and the deceptive warmth of a wood-burning hearth. Rebecca Thompson moved through this den of wolves with the practiced stillness of an obscure. Her black uniform was a shroud, her hair pulled back with a severity that matched the iron discipline in her eyes. At 29 she had mastered the most dangerous art of all, being a witness whom no one bothered to see. It was a survival skill in a town where the truth was a commodity and silence was the only currency that didn't depreciate. She moved with a fluid, lethal efficiency, refilling crystal flutes, clearing the remnants of deals struck in hushed tones, her eyes never rising above the lapels of the powerful. She saw it all. The senator with a nervous tic, the developer with blood under his fingernails, the fixer who made problems vanish for a price. "More tea, sir." Her voice was a low, professional rasp, controlled, neutral, hiding the fire beneath the ice. Tonight the atmosphere didn't just vibrate, it bruised. The air had the heavy, metallic charge of a coming storm, the kind that levels cities and exposes the foundations. Across the room, Cho Yang-eun didn't just occupy a table, he held it under siege. At 41 he was a man who didn't ask for the world to move. He expected the axis to shift simply because he willed it. He was a titan of construction and import on the front page, but a king of the underworld in the footnotes. Rebecca had walked these floors for 3 years, a shadow among the elite. She needed this floor-level vantage point to see the rot in the men who claimed to lead. But tonight the mask was about to crack. Tonight the shadow was stepping into the light, and Cho Yang-eun was about to learn that some obscures don't just haunt, they judge. The heavy glass doors of the Golden Crane hadn't even finished settling into their frames before Cho Yang-eun was tearing his sunglasses from his face, his breath coming in ragged, erratic hitches. The rain outside was a cold, unforgiving sheet, turning the Chicago skyline into a blurred graveyard of steel and glass, but Cho didn't feel the chill. He felt the burn, the white-hot, corrosive sting of a public execution that had left no physical marks. He climbed into the back of his waiting black sedan, slamming the door with a violence that rocked the chassis. "Drive," he hissed, his voice a low, feral growl that made his driver's eyes dart nervously to the rearview mirror. As the car pulled away, the interior light flickered over Cho's face, revealing a mask of fractured ego. The hunter was bleeding. For decades he had built his world on the absolute certainty that he was the apex, the man who held the leash. Now a waitress, a woman he had dismissed as a mere shadow in his periphery, had unmasked herself as the architect of the very floor he stood upon. He pulled his encrypted phone from his breast pocket, his fingers trembling with a mix of adrenaline and pure, unadulterated rage. He didn't call his office, he called his shadows. "I want everything," he barked into the receiver, his eyes fixed on the rain-streaked window, seeing only Rebecca's unshakable, steady gaze, every bank record, every foster home, every person she's ever spoken to. "I want to know what she eats, where she sleeps, and whose blood she's hiding under those designer threads." Obscure, he was looking for a crack, a secret, a singular point of failure he could hammer until her entire world collapsed. "If she has an obscure father, find his grave and dig it up," he commanded, his voice dropping to a voracious whisper. "If she has a debt, buy it. If she has a friend, break them. I want a scorched earth report on Rebecca Thompson by dawn. I want her invisible again, or I want her gone." Obscure, the car cut through the Chicago night like a blade, moving through back alleys and neon-lit thoroughfares. Obscure. Cho watched the city pass, his mind racing through 1,000 scenarios of vengeance. Obscure, he wasn't just planning a business move. He was preparing for a reckoning. Obscure. He had been humbled in his own temple and in his world, a king who is laughed at as a king who is dead. Obscure, as he stared into the darkness, the dragon of his ambition coiled tighter, fueled by the terrifying realization that for the first time in his life, he was the one being hunted by a truth he couldn't buy. The Golden Crane was still humming with the hushed, electric aftershocks of the confrontation when Rebecca Thompson stepped into the private elevator. The doors hissed shut, cutting off the world of silk and porcelain, leaving her alone in the vibrating silence of the ascent. She didn't look at her reflection in the mirrored walls. She didn't need to see the obscure she had been for 3 years. She only felt the weight of the apron she had cast aside, a skin shed in favor of a much older, colder armor. Her inner sanctum was a minimalist expanse of glass and shadows, perched high above the Chicago skyline. It was a room designed for clarity and calculated war. She moved to her desk, the tailored designer dress rustling like a warning. With a practiced, lethal efficiency, she bypassed the security protocols on her private terminal. This was the true floor of the restaurant, the one where the numbers lived and where the masks were stripped away. She began to pull the threads of Cho Yang-eun's financial empire. On the surface, it was a monolith of construction and infrastructure, but as she dove deeper into the encrypted ledgers, the sharp suit of his corporate identity began to tear. The ink on the digital page didn't just tell a story of profit. It screamed of voracious exploitation. She found the shell companies, the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, and the community development funds that were nothing more than a front for systematic displacement. As the clock ticked toward 4 a.m, the city below breathing in fitful gasps, Rebecca found what she was looking for, the blood in the ink. There were payments to silent partners with names that made her blood turn to ice, men who profited from the very shadows the law couldn't reach. Cho hadn't just been rude to a waitress. He had been a primary architect of a network that fed on the vulnerable. Every dollar in his ledger was an admission of a life he had squeezed for margin. She leaned back, the blue light of the monitor reflecting in her dark, defiant eyes. Cho was out there in the rain, digging for her past, looking for a way to break a waitress. He didn't realize that she was already inside his house, holding the matches. She wasn't just an owner protecting her restaurant. She was a witness who had finally decided to judge. The ledger was open, the sins were tallied, and Rebecca Thompson was no longer interested in being invisible. The invitation didn't arrive via a standard courier. It was delivered by a man in a charcoal suit who stood in the lobby of the Golden Crane like a sentinel guarding a tomb. The envelope was heavy, cream-colored, and smelled faintly of the same expensive cologne that had preceded Cho Yang-eun's arrogance 3 nights prior. Rebecca took it with a hand that remained a study in absolute stillness. Inside, the message was brief, written in a hand that attempted to project a grace the man didn't possess. A formal dinner. My territory. Let us settle the debt. Cho's territory was a private club buried in the bowels of a skyscraper that overlooked the dark, churning waters of Lake Michigan. The room was a cathedral of dark mahogany and low-slung leather, the air thick with the suffocating weight of old money and the silence of men who bought and sold the law. Cho sat at the head of a table that could have seated 20, his dark glasses finally cast aside to reveal eyes that were sharp, voracious, and currently rimmed with the desperation of a man who realized his leash had been cut. He didn't offer a greeting. He gestured to a leather briefcase sitting on the white linen, its silver latches catching the amber glow of the candlelight. There is 500,000 in there, Rebecca, he said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp that lacked its usual bite. A gesture of goodwill. An apology for the misunderstanding at the Crane. We're both business people. We know that pride is an expensive luxury, but silence is an investment. Rebecca didn't sit. She stood at the edge of the table, her silhouette cutting through the dim light like a blade. She didn't look at the briefcase. She looked at Cho, seeing the slight tremor in his fingers as he reached for a glass of whiskey. He was trying to buy his way back into the light, trying to treat the shattering of his ego as a line item on a balance sheet. To him, the insult wasn't the crime. Being caught by someone with more power was the only sin. You think this is a negotiation, Cho, she said softly, her voice carrying a precision that made the room feel even smaller. You think you can put a price on the dignity you tried to strip from my staff? She leaned in, the blue light of the distant city reflecting in her dark, defiant eyes. But I didn't come here to settle a debt. I came here to tell you that I've seen your ledgers. I know where the blood is. And there isn't enough paper in that bag to buy your way out of what's coming next. The air in the private club was stagnant, thick with the smell of old money and the slow decay of morality, but it fractured the moment Rebecca Thompson stepped into the light. She didn't enter as the shadow who refilled glasses or the obscure who cleared the wreckage of men's appetites. She arrived in iron and silk. Her dress was a midnight black armor, tailored with a precision that didn't just suggest authority. It demanded a ceasefire. Every step she took across the mahogany floor was a rhythmic, unrelenting hammer blow against Cho Yang-eun's failing composure. Cho sat at the head of the table, his hand frozen around a crystal glass of amber liquid, watching her approach with the wide-eyed dread of a man seeing a storm materialize in his own living room. He looked for the waitress, the girl he could break with a sneer or a $500,000 bribe, but she was nowhere to be found. In her place stood a titan. Rebecca didn't wait for him to stand. She reached the table and pulled out the chair directly opposite him, the heavy wood scraping against the floor with a sound like a blade being sharpened. She sat, her spine a straight line of cold defiance, and leaned forward just enough to invade his personal space. The briefcase full of cash sat between them like a dead animal, ignored and rotting. "You're in my seat, Cho," she said, her voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to make the very walls of the club lean in to listen. I don't understand," Cho stammered, his gravelly rasp cracking into a thin, desperate whine. "This is a private club. My associates, the board, they all meet here." "They met here because I allowed it," Rebecca replied, her dark eyes locking onto his with a voracious intensity that stripped him bare. "I didn't just buy the Golden Crane, Cho. I bought the building you're sitting in. I bought the debt on your firm's latest infrastructure project. I own the ground you walk on, the air you breathe in this room, and the very chair that is currently struggling to support your ego." She reached out, her fingers brushing the edge of the white linen, her touch making the expensive fabric look cheap. "You didn't insult a waitress. You insulted the person who holds the keys to your survival. You looked at the sun and thought you could tell it when to shine." She leaned back, the blue city lights behind her framing her like a dark halo. "Now put that money back in the bag. I don't want your charity. I want the deed to your integrity, but we both know that's been in default for years." The silence that followed Rebecca's ultimatum was heavy, a suffocating blanket of mahogany and unsaid truths. But the quiet didn't last. It was broken by the sound of the double doors at the far end of the club swinging open. Cho Yang-eun turned his face to a mask of sweating glass, expecting his security or perhaps the police. Instead he saw the uniforms. They walked in with the steady, rhythmic cadence of an army that had been waiting in the trenches for years. The servers, the busboys, the quiet men who parked the cars and the women who stood in the back of the kitchens where the heat reached 100 degrees. They didn't belong in this temple of luxury, yet they marched to the table with a collective gravity that made the room feel like it was sinking. "You didn't just insult a waitress, Cho," Rebecca said, her eyes never leaving his. "You insulted a witness. And I wasn't the only one." One by one they spoke. Their voices weren't loud, but they carried the visceral weight of scars. Elena, a hostess from a club Cho had closed down 3 years ago, stepped forward. She didn't describe a business deal. She described the night Cho had thrown a crystal decanter at her for failing to recognize his status in a crowded lobby. Then came Marcus, who spoke of the 3 months of wages Cho's firm had withheld to cover a margin call, leaving his family to choose between rent and medicine. The stories poured out like blood from an old wound, the quiet cruelties Rebecca had missed while she was busy playing obscure music in her own restaurant. She felt the iron in her chest tighten. She had been so focused on the high-level rot that she'd overlooked the casualties at her feet. Every word was a hammer blow to the foundation of Cho's lie. He wasn't just a rude customer. He was a hunter who hunted the people who were invisible to the world. Cho's gravelly rasp had disappeared entirely. He looked at the faces, the people he had treated as furniture, as background noise, as less than human. For the first time he didn't see the level of service. He saw the eyes of his judges. "You see them now, Cho?" Rebecca whispered, the blue city lights casting a cold, judgmental glow across her face. "They are the ones who built the chair you're sitting in. They are the ones whose dignity you thought was a line item you could delete." She stood, her designer armor catching the candlelight. "And tonight, their voices are the only currency I'm accepting." Cho looked around, his posture finally collapsing into a heap of terrified silence. He was no longer the apex hunter. He was a man surrounded by the obscures of his own sins, and the light was finally, mercifully, being turned on. The fluorescent lights of the city planning archives hummed with a low, persistent buzz that felt like a migraine in the making. Rebecca sat at a long, scarred oak table, surrounded by the skeletal remains of the city's expansion. blueprints, permits, and thousand-page contracts that buried the truth in a mountain of legalese. She didn't look tired. She looked like a hunter who had finally cornered her prey in the high grass. As the morning sun began to bleed a pale, anemic light through the dusty windows, she found it. Deep within the riders of Cho Yang-eun's primary city infrastructure contract, the multi-billion-dollar project that was the spine of his empire, lay a community integrity clause. It was a vestigial piece of legislation, a moral footnote meant to satisfy activists but never intended to be enforced. It stated that any primary contractor found in violation of ethical labor standards or community displacement protocols would face immediate non-negotiable termination. Cho had treated it as a joke, a fly to be swatted away with a bribe or a well-placed donation. But he hadn't accounted for a witness with a master key. Rebecca reached for her satellite phone, her fingers moving with the cold, rhythmic precision of a soldier loading a magazine. She didn't call the city council. She called the Auditor General, a man whose career had been a long, lonely march through the desert of corruption, waiting for a drop of water. "I have the kill switch," she said, her voice a low, resonant vibration in the empty archive room. "Check the writers on the Southside Transit Project. Cross-reference the labor displacement logs from the third quarter with the incident reports I'm uploading now. Cho isn't just in breach. He's in default." She watched the progress bar on her screen move with agonizing slowness, each percentage point a footstep toward the ledge. Cho thought he was building a legacy of concrete and steel, but he had built it on a foundation of lies, and Rebecca had just pulled the pin. "Terminate the contract," she commanded, her dark eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the monitor. "He's been playing God with other people's lives for too long. It's time we reminded him that even titans can be evicted." As she closed the heavy file, the sound echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. The city below was waking up, its citizens heading to work on the very roads Cho had built, unaware that the ground was about to vanish from beneath his feet. Rebecca stood, her midnight black armor uncreased, her silhouette a study in lethal grace. The war wasn't over, but the air was finally starting to clear, and for Cho Yang-eun the storm had just made landfall. The rain had turned into a torrential downpour, a relentless gray curtain that turned the Chicago skyline into a collection of ragged, weeping monuments. Cho Yang-eun stood in the center of a half-finished construction site, his kingdom of skeletal iron and poured concrete now smelling of wet dust and impending ruin. He was a man stripped of his polished office and his leather-bound confidence. His suit was soaked, clinging to him like a second desperate skin, but the fury in his eyes remained a burning radioactive coal. Rebecca Thompson arrived without a siren or an escort. She stepped over the muddy tracks of the heavy machinery, her silhouette cutting through the gloom with a terrifying, unhurried grace. She didn't carry an umbrella. She didn't seek cover. She stood before him, the wind whipping her hair like a dark flag of war, her eyes a deep, unfathomable well of resolve. "You think you've won?" Cho roared, his voice a raw, primal rasp that was nearly swallowed by the thunder. He stepped toward her, his hand reaching into his jacket, his fingers white-knuckled around the handle of a cold, steel weight. "You think you can just flip a switch and delete 30 years of my life? I built this city. I am the blood in these veins." He lunged forward, stopping inches from her face, the scent of expensive scotch and raw desperation radiating off him in waves. He pulled the weapon, the metal gleaming dully in the lightning. He pressed it against the soft skin beneath her jaw, his hand shaking with a lethal combination of rage and the realization that his life was a hollow shell. "Give me the keys to the archive," he hissed, his face a mask of ragged, broken pride. "Call the auditor. Tell them it was a mistake. Tell them you lied. Or I will leave you in the foundation of the very building you think you own." Rebecca didn't. She didn't blink. She didn't even draw a ragged breath. She leaned into the cold pressure of the steel, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that seemed to drain the very color from his world. "The mistake wasn't the contract, Cho," she said, her voice a low, lethal vibration that cut through the thunder. "The mistake was thinking that fear is a weapon you can use on a person who has already walked through the fire." She stepped closer, forcing him to either pull the trigger or retreat. "You aren't a king, Cho. You're just a man with a piece of metal standing in the rain trying to kill the truth. And the truth doesn't bleed." For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound was the hammer of the rain on the steel beams. Then Cho's hand began to lower, The hunter was gone. All that remained was a man who had finally realized that his status was a garment he could no longer afford to wear. Rebecca didn't look back as she turned and walked away into the darkness, leaving him alone in the ruins of his own making. The high-rise boardroom was a tomb of glass and cold ambition, overlooking a city that had no idea its foundations were about to be liquidated. Around the table sat the investors, men with tailored consciences and portfolios built on the silence of the exploited. They didn't care about the mud or the thunder. They only cared about the margin. Cho Yang-eun wasn't here. He was still out in the rain, an obscure haunting his own ruins, unaware that the final nail was being driven into his coffin by a hand he had once tried to buy. Rebecca Thompson didn't enter with a presentation or a plea. She walked in with a heavy black dossier that hit the mahogany table with a sound like a gavel. She looked at the men, the silent architects of Cho's rise, and saw the flicker of annoyance in their eyes. They saw a waitress who had somehow climbed too high. They didn't see the judge. Cho didn't just build your skyscrapers, Rebecca said, her voice a low, gravelly vibration that cut through the expensive hum of the climate control. He built a network of voracious displacement and labor violations that has now triggered the community integrity clause in every city contract he holds. She didn't wait for them to process the legal jargon. She opened the dossier, revealing the photographs of the families Cho had evicted and the bank statements of the subcontractors he had bled dry. The Auditor General has already pulled the plug. Cho isn't an asset anymore. He's a liability that is currently on fire. The air in the room shifted, turning sharp and metallic with the scent of a sinking ship. These men didn't have loyalty, they had exits. Rebecca watched as they leaned in, their dark eyes reflecting the cold blue light of the digital evidence she began to broadcast onto the wall. She showed them the blood in the ink, the same blood she had found in her inner sanctum. She showed them that Cho's status was a hollow garment, and that by supporting him, they were now standing in the center of a federal investigation. "You have 10 minutes to vote him out of the chair," she said, her silhouette a study in lethal grace against the backdrop of the weeping Chicago skyline. "After that, I leak these files to the press and your names go on the front page alongside his. Cho is done. The only question is whether you want to go down with the man who thought a waitress was his biggest problem." She didn't stay to hear the vote. She turned and walked out, the sound of her heels on the marble echoing like the final beat of a heart. Behind her, the wolves began to tear each other apart. The foundation hadn't just been exposed, it had been demolished. And as she stepped back into the elevator, Rebecca Thompson knew that the storm was finally clearing the way for a truth that could no longer be silenced. The city of Chicago didn't just wake up to the news, it woke up to a funeral. By 6 in the morning, the digital screens of the loop were bleeding the same black and white truth Rebecca had laid bare in the boardroom. The headlines were a flurry of ragged, accusing fonts. Cho Construction Default Federal Integrity Probe, the hidden cost of growth. The house of cards hadn't just begun to buckle. It was being incinerated by a public fury that had been waiting for a singular target. Cho Yang-eun watched it all from the back of a taxi he'd hailed in the rain, his private fleet of sedans having been seized or abandoned as his staff realized the gravity of the shift. He stared at a newsstand where his own face glared back at him, not as the titan of infrastructure but as a hunter unmasked. The legal machinery of the state was moving with a cold, unrelenting momentum. Subpoenas were hitting his satellite offices before the secretaries could even brew the morning coffee. His bank accounts, once vast and deep as the Great Lakes, were frozen solid, leaving him with nothing but the cash in his pockets and the stench of his own failure. The scrutiny was visceral. It wasn't just the lawyers in their gray rooms, it was the people. The subcontractors he'd bled dry were walking off his sites, leaving skeletons of iron to rust in the damp air. The families he'd displaced were gathering outside his headquarters, their silence more deafening than any riot. Cho felt the air thinning, the very atmosphere of the city turning toxic to his lungs. Every connection he'd spent decades cultivating, the nervous politicians, the paid-off fixers, the lawyers who lived in the shadows, had vanished. In the world of the apex hunter, there is no room for the wounded, and Cho was bleeding out in the light of day. Rebecca Thompson watched the collapse from the quiet of the Golden Crane, the monitors in her office displaying the systematic demolition of a legacy built on bone and lies. She didn't feel the rush of victory. She felt the grim satisfaction of a surgeon who had finally removed the rot. She looked at the city through the glass, the morning light painting the skyscrapers in shades of pale amber and blood. Cho's empire was a hollow shell, a monument to the delusion that power is a garment you can never be stripped of. He had thought he was the architect, but he had merely been a tenant in a world that belonged to the people he refused to see. The cards were falling, and as the sirens began to wail in the distance, Rebecca knew the reckoning had only just begun. The golden crane was nearly empty, the midnight air thick with the scent of rain and expensive ironies. Rebecca Thompson stood at the edge of the darkened dining room, her silhouette framed by the amber glow of a single remaining chandelier. The staff had gone, the doors were locked, but she hadn't left. She was waiting for the final act of a play that had started with an insult and was ending in a reckoning. The glass doors rattled, not with the confident authority of a king, but with the frantic, scratching desperation of a dying animal. Rebecca watched as Cho Yang-eun stumbled into the room. He was unrecognizable. The sharp suit was a ruin of mud and sweat. The dark glasses were gone, revealing eyes that were red-rimmed and hollowed out by the absolute vacuum of his own failure. He didn't walk. He drifted toward the center of the room, his knees buckling until he finally collapsed into the very chair where he had once mocked a waitress's worth. "Rebecca," he wheezed, the word tearing out of his throat like a shard of glass. He reached out, his hands trembling violently on the white linen table, hands that were empty of power, empty of status, empty of hope. "They're taking it all. The firm, the accounts, the property. I have nothing left. I have nowhere to go." Rebecca didn't move. She stood in the shadows, her voice a low, lethal vibration that seemed to come from the very floorboards. "You had a life, Cho. You had a city. You had the loyalty of people who didn't know you were hollow. You traded it all for the thrill of a boot on a neck." Cho's head dropped to the table, a sob racking his frame. "I'm sorry," he gasped, the words sounding alien coming from a mouth that had only known how to sneer. "I was wrong. Please, talk to the auditor. Tell the press it was personal. Give me back my life. I'll do anything. I'll pay any price." "That's the problem, Cho," Rebecca said, stepping into the light, her designer armor gleaming with a cold, unforgiving brilliance. "You still think mercy is a transaction. You think you can buy a clean slate with a late apology." She walked to the table, looking down at the broken man who had once tried to destroy her soul with a glance. "I sat at this table and watched you humiliate people for sport. I watched you treat dignity like a garment you could tear off. Now you want me to be the one important person who is watching? You want me to see your humanity now that it's all you have left?" She leaned in, her eyes locking onto his with a final, devastating precision. "The answer is no. I won't lie for you. I won't save you. Because true power isn't about being seen. It's about seeing the truth. And the truth is you aren't a monster, Cho. You're just a man who forgot how to be human. And that's a debt you'll have to settle with the silence you created." The silence of the golden crane was no longer empty. It was heavy with the presence of obscures. Rebecca Thompson stood over the man who had once been a titan, watching him shiver in the remains of his status. She didn't look down at him with hatred. That would have required an emotional investment he no longer earned. She looked at him with the clinical, devastating clarity of a priest witnessing a confession from a man who had forgotten God. "You asked me that first night if I understood the menu," she said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that cut through the darkness of the dining room. "But you were the one who couldn't read the room. You saw an apron and a tray and you thought you were looking at a servant. You didn't realize you were looking at a mirror." She walked slowly around the table, her designer silk rustling like the wings of a voracious bird. "I've owned this building for 5 years, Cho. I could have run it from a boardroom on the 50th floor. Surrounded by lawyers and yes-men who would have told me I was a god. But power is a deceptive garment. It makes you blind. It makes you think that the people who serve you aren't watching your soul." She stopped directly behind him, her hands resting lightly on the back of the chair, the same chair she had told him she owned. "I worked the floor because I wanted to see the man behind the sunglasses. I wanted to know who you were when you thought no one important was watching. I wanted to see if the sharp suit was hiding a leader or just a well-dressed hollow." She leaned down, her breath cold against his ear. "And I saw you, Cho. I saw the way you treated the hostess who stuttered. I saw the way you dismissed the busboy who didn't move fast enough. I saw a man who believed that his bank balance gave him the right to be a monster in the dark. You were a test and you failed before I even brought you the bill. Cho looked up, his face a mask of ragged, broken pride. So this was all a trap? No, Rebecca replied, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that seemed to drain the last of the air from the room. It was a revelation. I didn't create the rot in your foundation, Cho. I just turned on the lights so the neighbors could see it. I worked the floor to find the truth, and the truth is that you aren't worth the chair you're sitting in. You thought you were the hunter, but you were just the noise. And now the room is finally silent. The end didn't come with a bang. It came with the cold, rhythmic scratching of pens on legal vellum. In a series of emergency hearings that felt more like a court-martial than a board meeting, Cho Yang-eun was stripped of his titles, his stock options, and his very name. The corporate gods he had worshipped turned their backs, realizing the garment of his status was now soaked in the kerosene of a federal probe. Rebecca stood at the back of the room, her silhouette a dark, unyielding sentinel against the floor-to-ceiling windows. She watched as they escorted him out, his shoulders hunched as if he were trying to disappear into the ruins of his own sharp suit. He was no longer the apex, he was the debris. But Rebecca didn't stay in the shadows to savor the wreckage. She knew that a cleansing fire is useless unless you build something worth keeping in the ashes. She stepped out from the invisible sanctuary of the Golden Crane and into the harsh, flickering glare of the public square. She stood on the steps of City Hall, the Chicago wind whipping her dark hair like a battle flag, surrounded not by lawyers, but by the host of faces she had once ignored. The servers, the drivers, the men and women who were the true muscle of the city's heart. Status is a lie we tell ourselves to justify cruelty, she told the gathered press, her voice a low, gravelly vibration that carried the weight of iron. We've spent too long looking at the sharp suits and ignoring the hands that built them. No more. She didn't just speak, she legislated. She used the power Cho had once tried to buy to force a citywide universal respect charter. A moral kill switch that made labor dignity as non-negotiable as the structural integrity of the skyscrapers themselves. She became the visible face of a movement that demanded a reckoning for every invisible worker in the loop. She didn't offer charity, she offered a seat at the table. The city watched as the woman who had untied her apron to unmask a monster now used her authority to shield the vulnerable. The fire had done its work, burning away the rot of the old guard, and as Rebecca looked out over the crowd, she saw the shift. It wasn't just a win for the Golden Crane. It was a ceasefire in a war that had been fought in the shadows for far too long. The light was finally on, and it was staying on. The Golden Crane no longer smelled of the sharp metallic sweat of fear or the cloying expensive musk of Cho's arrogance. It smelled of cedar, of fresh rain, and the honest warmth of a hearth that finally belonged to the people who tended it. The crystal chandeliers still hung like frozen tears, but the light they cast across the mirror-polished floors was different. No longer a spotlight for the hunters, but a steady glow that reached the corners where the invisible used to hide. Rebecca Thompson stood in the center of the dining room, her midnight black armor replaced by a simpler, unyielding elegance. She watched as the new shifts arrived, their spines straight, their eyes clear, moving with the quiet dignity of people who knew their names were written in the foundation. The Universal Respect Charter wasn't just a document filed in a dusty city archive. It was the heartbeat of the room. It was the silent precision she had always valued, now weaponized as a standard that made the air feel cleaner, colder, and infinitely more solid. She called Marcus over, the man who had once been a manager in name only, a shield for the rot she had overlooked while playing obscure. He approached her, his face no longer a mask of ragged, broken worry, but a study in newfound authority. Rebecca didn't reach for a tray or an apron. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a heavy brass key and a leather-bound ledger. "The building is clear, Marcus," she said, her voice a low, gravelly vibration that carried the resonance of a ceasefire. "The debt is settled. The shadow is gone." She pressed the key into his palm, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that signaled the end of one war and the beginning of a much harder peace. "I'm not looking for a manager anymore. I'm looking for a partner. Someone who knows that the view from the floor is the only one that matters." Marcus looked at the key, then back at the woman who had burned down an empire to save a single table. He didn't thank her. In the world they had built, gratitude was found in the work, not the words. He simply nodded, his silhouette a dark sentinel against the golden light of the dining room. The Golden Crane had been transformed into a sanctuary, a place where the invisible were finally seen, and where the sharp suits knew that the axis of the world didn't shift for them. Rebecca stood by the wood-burning hearth, the fire reflecting in her eyes, watching as the first guests of the evening arrived. The masks were off, the lights were on, and the new standard was set in stone. The final traces of the storm had retreated, leaving Chicago's streets slick and shimmering under a cold, moonlit sky. Inside the golden crane, the air was still, save for the rhythmic orange heartbeat of the wood-burning hearth. The war was over. The ledgers were closed, the hunters were caged, and the community integrity clause was now the law of the land. Rebecca Thompson stood in the quiet of her office, the midnight black designer dress hanging in the wardrobe like a discarded suit of armor. She didn't need it tonight. She reached for the black cotton apron, the fabric rough and honest against her palms. She tied it behind her neck with the same steady, unhurried hands that had once untied it to dismantle an empire. She wasn't shedding her authority, she was grounding it. She understood now that the view from the 50th floor was a vanity, but the view from the floor was a mission. She stepped out into the dining room. At the far corner table, beneath the golden light of the chandelier, sat a young man and his mother. They weren't powerful. They weren't wearing sharp suits or dark glasses. They were people who had once been invisible, displaced by Cho's greed and restored by Rebecca's resolve. She approached them with the fluid, lethal efficiency of an obscure who had finally found her home. She didn't look down at her shoes, she looked into their eyes. She didn't see customers. She saw the reason she hadn't let the fire consume her. "Good evening," she said, her voice a low, gravelly rasp that carried the warmth of a ceasefire. "I'll be taking care of you tonight." She poured the water with a hand that was steady in absolute precision, the liquid catching the light like liquid diamonds. She moved with a grace that Cho Yang-eun could never have bought, a power that didn't need to bark orders or demand a manager. It was the power of a woman who knew that status is merely a garment, something easily torn, easily shed, easily replaced, but character is skin. It is what remains when the lights are turned on and the sharp suits are stripped away. She took their order, her expression no longer unreadable, but alive with a quiet, unyielding respect. As she walked back toward the kitchen, her silhouette a dark sentinel against the hearth light, she knew the shift was complete. She had started this journey to see the man behind the sunglasses, but she had ended it by finding the woman behind the owner. Rebecca Thompson returned to the floor not because the world expected her to, but because she finally knew that true power never needs to prove itself. It only needs to serve.